their country fractured into parts. Some of the fracturing was easier in countries like Slovenia, now a country. It was easier because it was relatively ethnically homogeneous. But in some other parts of the former Yugoslavia, ethnic groups were intermingled in a sense, and there was a huge fight over territory and what would be the new component parts of any new countries created. And perhaps the worst of that fighting took place in Bosnia and Herzegovina. There are an estimated 100 to 200,000 people who died in those wars. That's a huge number, obviously. There are also an estimated 50,000 rapes that took place as part of the campaign of ethnic cleansing and the attacks on civilians. And one of the worst events of the war, but not the only terrible thing, there were prison camps, there were detention centers, shelling of villages, etc., but was this massacre at Srebrenica. And one of the things that I think brought it so much to international attention was that it was a United Nations safe haven. Srebrenica is a town fairly close to the border of Serbia. It's located in Bosnia, and it was an area that was seen of tremendous strategic importance. There was a lot of fighting in the area. The United Nations, to protect the Muslim population there, had created what they called a safe haven by a Security Council resolution, and had sent a Dutch battalion there to essentially hold that space for the civilians. As we heard this morning, the battalion was too small. The Serb army was too ferocious, and what happened in the summer of 1995 is, as the Muslim defenders of the area withdrew, the United Nations peacekeepers really found themselves unable to meet the demands of the advancing Serb army. And in the afternoon, when General Mladic marched into Srebrenica and demanded the surrender, there was really very little they could do. And then I think you've heard through other speakers how the men were ultimately taken prisoner and killed for the most part, estimated 6,000 to 8,000 men and boys who were killed, and about 23,000 women were put onto buses with their children and younger men, and they were bussed out of the area. The death toll is obviously shocking, but the deportations were equally shocking. And I think it's one of the reasons why we look at Srebrenica and we say this particular event, even though the conflict overall was horrific in scale and in the atrocities committed, this one atrocity does stand out. And of course, juridically, we'll explore with our panel of experts why it was so significant that it was labeled a genocide and what that means. So now I'm going to turn to my panelists. They've decided we should do this as kind of a question and answer, and we'll start each one off with a question. Everybody feel free to jump in. And Mark, maybe we could start with you, because you were there at the beginning. And you had suggested maybe we look at the Ardemovic case first, which wasn't really discussed very much this morning. It's an early case, 96 to 98. What was the significance of that case? How did it help you and the prosecutor's office acquire the tools you needed to prosecute these cases? What kind of evidence, et cetera?
Well, to answer that question, let me give you a little more background. In the hot summer days of July of 1995, the Bosnian Serbs decided to restrict the size of the enclave, which sat in the middle of territory that was coveted by the Bosnian Serbs. It was a festering sore. It had been a festering sore in their body, and they wanted to get rid of it. They initially started by trying to reduce the size, but by the 9th of July, it dawned on them that there was no resistance, little or no resistance. As a result of that, their military activity was to take over the enclave. That forced the population, probably 25 to 30,000 people, into a small village called Podachari. Different and separately, there was a column of men, 15,000 approximately, who tried to flee the enclave and make it up to Bosnian Muslim territory. That column started out during the takeover. It was interdicted, and only a third of the column was able to get through into Bosnian Muslim territory. some of those members of the column were armed. The people who were caught behind the Serb lines were pulled out and lured out of the hills around Srebrenica by Bosnian Serb soldiers wearing, for example, UN helmets and UN gear. And as a result of the collection of those men who were lured out of the hills, they were separated and they were put in fields. At the same time, men were being separated in Podachari as the women were being bussed out. The men were being separated, and those two large groups of victims, ultimate victims, were then were collected and then moved to distant parts of Bosnia, remote parts of Bosnia, where the international eyes, the Dutch battalion, could not see what was happening to them, and they were summarily executed over a series of days. Now, since the events that were taking place in Srebrenica were being reported real time, the ICTY put investigators into Tuzla, as I recall, in either late July or early August, and that's where the victims, the people who had been bussed, were being brought into an area where they could be taken care of. And that's where the remnants of the survivors of the column also located in Tuzla. We knew early on in the investigation that men had disappeared, and we were operating in a context of systematic denial by the Bosnian Serb authorities and the Bosnian Serb military. Nothing happened to the men. That's what was said to us repeatedly. So ultimately, the picture emerged as survivors from these massacres started to straggle out into territory where they were free and safe. I think my recollection is there were probably 14 survivors out of the 7,000 to 8,000 people who were intentionally murdered. There were 14 survivors. And it soon became clear to us what had happened to the men. And the investigative difficulty that we had was to determine what we thought had happened to the men. They had been killed. Where had those murders taken place? Since we had no eyes or ears in that part of the territory. Okay. As you know, the men were put on buses and they were taken oftentimes blindfolded. They were put in schools. They were far away from their homes, and they couldn't describe to us where these murders took place. Now let's focus on Mr. Erdemovic to answer your question. Mr. Erdemovic was a young Bosnian Croat who was a soldier in a special forces unit of the Bosnian Serb army. On the 16th of July, Dražan Erdemovic participated in a systematic murder of 1,200 people at a location called the Branjevo Military Farm. And bus after bus of prisoner, defenseless Muslim men and boys were brought and summarily executed at this location. Those massacres took place for 5 hours. And at the end of those 5 hours, Erdemovic was asked to participate in additional murders at a nearby village called Pilica, and he declined. He said essentially he'd had enough for the day, but some of his more eager and zealous mates participated. Erdemovic then went down to the village of Pilica and observed from across the street in a cafe, observed these murders. Now, from the Branjevo military farm, there were probably 2 or 3 survivors who made it out into the free territory. From the Pilica Cultural Dome, there were no survivors. It was something that was not on our radar. So now let's talk about Mr. Erdemovic and how he came to the attention of the ICTY. Erdemovic was not liked by his mates because he was a Bosnian Croat, and he was distrusted. He had declined participating in additional executions, and he was shot 3 times by his former colleagues, his fellow executioners, They attempted to kill him. They didn't succeed. And Erdemovich ultimately gave an interview in Belgrade to a reporter who had recordings of the interview with Erdemovich as well as a map of the location. And when she tried to get through the airport, she was arrested, and the tapes were confiscated, and Erdemovich was also arrested. Now, in what is a little known, but I think a very significant event, Judge Goldstone asked the court to issue an order to the authorities in Belgrade to produce Mr. Erdemovich. And I have marveled over the years at the effect of that. They produced Mr. Erdemovich. Mr. Erdemovich came to The Hague, and he was an insider who had particularly good knowledge about the murders, the location of the murders, who gave the orders, the chain of command, and as a real insider, he was able to corroborate at least two of the survivors who said they had been executed at the Braniewo military farm. He identified the location, and then we had to corroborate Mr. Erdemovich, and we corroborated Mr. Erdemovich's evidence by the use of aerial images. The massacres at Braniewo military farm took place on the 16th of July, 1995, and the U.S. government supplied us with an aerial image of the Braniewo military farm that took place on the 17th of July, one day later. And at that aerial image, you can see the bodies, you can see the excavation where the bodies are being buried, and Erdemovich could identify that as the location, and it corroborated Mr. Erdemovich. Mr. Erdemovich also described to us the massacres at the Pilica Cultural Dome, which we had no idea had been committed. And an aerial image, again taken on the 17th of July, the day later, showed the trucks backing up into the Pilica Cultural Dome, and obviously they were there to remove the bodies. And subsequently, as a result of Mr. Erdemovich's cooperation, we were able to get some traction in the investigation. We went to the Pilica Cultural Dome. John Rene Ruiz went to the Cultural Dome with a pair of, essentially, he found a pair of bolt cutters. The doors were locked. He cut open the doors to the Cultural Dome, and of course there was the grim remnants of a massacre. There were blood on the floor, shell casings, human tissue on the walls. I mean, it was a terrible sight. And so Mr. Erdemovich contributed significantly to us identifying another location. As I say, he identified perpetrators, he identified the chain of command for us. He testified in probably 6 or 7 of the Srebrenica trials. And as a collateral benefit from Mr. Erdemovich was the person who engaged in the first plea agreement at the ICTY. Mr. Erdemovich, as you know, when the tribunal started, or you may know, there was a resistance to plea bargaining. And I remember Judge Cassese had given a speech to the General Assembly, essentially saying there would be no plea agreements. Well, Mr. Erdemovich was, in my practice at the ICTY, one of the 2 people who was genuinely remorseful. He genuinely regretted that he had committed as many murders as he did. He had, by his own admission, depending on which statement you read, had committed between 10 and 100 of the 1,200 murders that took place at the Braniewo military farm. So he agreed to enter into a plea agreement. It was an oral agreement with me and his defense counsel. Eventually, he appealed the sentence, which was 10 years, The matter was reversed. I won't go into the reasons. And the first written plea agreement was executed. Pete McCloskey prepared the written plea agreement. And as a result of that precedent, there were many other, I think there were probably 20 plea agreements at the ICTY. And if you understand that the benefit of a plea agreement as opposed to a 6-month or 2-year trial for each case, it saved considerable time for us. So Mr. Erdemovich was a critical witness for us to start. And what was very, very important for us was it was a dispute publicly between the Bosnian Serbian authorities and the Belgrade authorities saying nothing happened. And here, for the first time, was an insider who actually participated in these murders. The significance of that cannot be underestimated. And so Mr. Erdemovich is a little footnote in the Srebrenica saga, but he's a very important footnote. And so that.
Thank you, Mark. There is quite a lot of story there that I didn't know, actually. Pat or Bill, do you have any comments on the Erdemovich case? Or?
Well, no, I heard some of this before, since I sat on the trial, as you'll find out. But
yeah. Would you like then to turn to our second question, which is for you, Pat, which is moving forward in time, looking perhaps at the Krstić case, which was referred to by Patty Vizer Sellers, the trial judgment in 2001 and the appeals judgment in 2004, which was the first case to convict for genocide. Do you want to talk maybe about that case and about its implications for jurisprudence going forward?
Sure. Well, I should point out, as you probably have surmised, that Mark was the chief prosecutor in the first Krstić case, and I was one of 3 judges. I will say, delving a little bit into the personal aspect of it, despite the fact that you didn't ask the question, I had just gotten over The Hague. I'd been there about 2 months, and the other 2 judges in what was known then as the French chamber. And that's because a judge on the ICTY at the time, and still probably, I don't know, had either to be fluent enough in either French or English, which were the official languages. But the chamber I was put in was known as the French chamber because the other 2 judges, while they did speak English and perfectly polite, they preferred to speak French. So before I got there, most of the documents that came out of that chamber were in French, actually. Now, I had 2 years of high school French at a little public high school in northwestern Connecticut, and I had a wonderful law clerk, went on to become an international law professor out at Stanford, and she actually signed up for lessons in downtown Hague, because at one point they told me, and I'll get on to the question in a minute, but you want background.
This is great.
They told me that, well, I said, I'm sorry, I will do the best I can. When I get all these documents in French and stuff, we will do the best we can with either the translation, but the translation was slow. If you put in a document for translation in The Hague in those days, it could be 3 weeks, I don't know, maybe 3 months before. So we would puzzle over as best we could, she and I, to get that out, and that kind of bothered my colleagues a little, and they said, well, we've been able to get these things out. I said, I'm doing the absolutely best thing we can, and they said, well, we previously had another judge in this chamber who only spoke English, but that judge always signed the documents anyway in French. So I said, I'm sorry, I just came from 20 years on the D.C. circuit, and I don't sign any documents that I don't understand. Henceforth, not sure it's a good thing, but henceforth, all the stuff that came out of that chamber came out in English. We were able to get, but this is just to give you a little bit. I was absolutely, the other 2 judges had been on the Blastich case. They did have some previous experience there. But in terms of this was the first case. After 2 months, we got the Srebenica case, the Kirstich case. But I should point out to you that we came out with a judgment 18 months later, which is really not bad considering the time lag, not just then, but subsequently in many cases. Also, during that entire time, we were also trying alternately the Omarska prison case, which is also a major ICTY case, which had 5 defendants who had run the Omarska and the AAA prison cases. So we would do a couple of weeks on one and then give those people a chance sort of to catch up with all the documentary stuff, and we'd move to the other. And so that was all done in this 2-year time period on there. So it was a very interesting, needless to say, case, and for me, just the experience of listening to the survivors, because as Mark knows, the initial parts of the case were primarily survivor testimony, and then there was that remarkable woman who had lost everybody in her family, her father, her husband, children. So it was an emotionally, sometimes devastating case. I would like to just address myself a little bit in light of Pat's speech this morning about the evolution or the possible evolution of the kinds of genocide. And this is by no way of justification, even if it comes out that way, of the fact that our particular finding of genocide, the genocide part was limited to the men's part. But I have to tell you, I think we're all children of our times. And to set the stage a little bit at that time, the only genocide convictions we had, you can't count Nuremberg as genocide because genocide had not been invented. Also, I'll give you a footnote. When I was in law school, I entered law school in 1948, and Raphael Lemkin was teaching a course there. He was the originator of genocide. I had no interest in it whatsoever. This was for those guys in the 3rd year who were going to go out and teach. I was going to be a labor lawyer representing unions, so I never went near any of that kind of thing. But at this particular time, we did have, of course, Rwanda, some of those, but that was a totally different situation. Rwanda, nobody denied there'd been a genocide, and all you had to do was look at all of that publicity that had gone out ahead of time and all the calls to kill the Tutsis, et cetera, so there really was no dispute. But the ICTY had never taken a genocide case through to trial before. I think that's correct. In fact, while I was there and during this whole period, there was the Jelisik case. Now, Jelisik was a head of some small, I don't remember, some small camp where prisoners were held. And he was obviously insane with the hate because he did Russian roulette with some of the prisoners. He called them cockroaches, said they ought to be wiped off the face of the earth. He was, a real case sort of thing. But they brought a genocide charge to him. And correct me if I get some of these facts wrong, Mark, but as I recall, the lower court, the trial court, dismissed the genocide case, but the prosecution appealed. And I was designated, I was a trial judge, but I was designated to fill somebody who was recused place on the appeal court. When it came up to the appeal court, we all agreed, I think it's okay to talk about these things now, but we all agreed that there was enough evidence to withstand a motion to dismiss, which comes at the middle of the trial after the prosecution's case. But a majority of the court said it was very clear they thought this should not be the first genocide case at the ICTY that would go through, because this was almost a nut case, as it were, kind of thing. And this would not have the aura or the wrappings at the first genocide case. So they said, we can, because there's enough evidence that clearly he's going to be convicted on these other cases, or even he'd admitted to some of them, crimes against humanity, we don't need the genocide. So we're going to uphold the dismissal, or simply not remand it, because we don't want this to be the first genocide case that goes to the ICTY. Now, ironically, Judge Shahabuddin and I dissented from that appellate ruling, because at that point I was kind of a stick-to-the-law person left over from my 20 years in the American courts. I didn't realize how creative you had to be in the international courts. So anyway, we dissented, but that's the way it went. And so therefore, when Kirstich came up, that obviously presented a much better vehicle. But I will say, just in reference to Pat's point this morning about our particular genocide ruling only covering the men's part, that in all honesty, and I'll get to this a little bit more in my speech for anybody that's left around by tomorrow noon, that it was a sort of miracle that we got the genocide conviction. It was not an open and shut case to begin with, because at this point, the only genocide convictions you had were basically the Rwandan case, which was, if anything, it was a parallel to the Holocaust but it was a national case. There were guilty pleas in the Rwandan courts to that, and there really was no dispute that that was a real genocide. So the cases posed to us by the prosecution was based upon what really was a novel genocide situation in those days, namely, not that everybody in the whole group had been killed, but rather the men had been taken off and killed, the women had been separated and bussed off to Tuzla with the children. And in fact, that was one of the main defenses, if I recall, Mark, was that this can't be a genocide because, look, first of all, you didn't kill everybody, so that doesn't mean that those women couldn't go and set up new families, et cetera, and that sort of thing. And, and apart from that, another reason is if you looked at all of the other villages that the Serbs had taken over, in no other ones of the villages had they killed the people. They might have imprisoned them in the Serb camps, they might have done bad things to them, but in no other case. So how can you say that they had genocidal intent? This is the only situation where they actually killed the people. That went to whether or not this really was a legitimate, quote, group under the genocide. But this was the situation, novel situation, put up to us by the prosecution. I suppose it's conceivable that if we were really brilliant people, we could have thought of the other side of the allegations. We did have testimony about some of the terrible things that happened to women, I think, sometimes initially in the first couple of days in Podakari, but those were all, as he pointed out, crimes against humanity. But whether or not we went as far as we could have gone, I think that, so we'll go into a little bit more later, I think that it was a significant first step in what I'll say unloosing the notion of genocide from its paradigmatic background, which would have been the way the Holocaust was perceived, even though you didn't have an actual genocide crime then, or